Wind came hard off Lake Superior that February, the kind that arrives without announcement and makes everything outside feel temporary. Corporal James Aldrich had driven down to Ashland, Wisconsin for one reason: to collect the last box of his father's things from the storage unit on Beezer Avenue, and he was 20 minutes from leaving when Scout went still in the back seat. Not restless. Still, the way he got when the air changed. Across the street, in front of the Ashland County Services Building, a woman sat on a concrete bench in a coat too thin for a wind like that, holding a folder of papers against her chest with both arms. And she was crying, not in the way people cry when they want to be seen, but in the way they cry when they believe no one is looking. What James Aldrich discovered when he crossed that street would expose a cover-up that reached from a county government office to a death that had been recorded as natural and hadn't been. If this is the kind of story you stay for, subscribe so you're here when the next one is told. James had enlisted at 20. Not because he was looking for something, but because he had already found too much of the wrong thing. He grew up in Park Falls, 3 hours north of Ashland, in the kind of town where the mill closing meant the town closing, and where the people who stayed did so out of loyalty to something they couldn't fully name. His father, Gordon Aldrich, had been one of those people, worked insulation and drywall until his knees gave out at 61. Stayed on in the house on Poplar Street, because leaving would have felt like agreeing that the town was finished. James had enlisted, come back, enlisted again, and come back again, and the version of himself that returned the second time was quieter than the first, in ways he was still measuring. He drove back to the North Wisconsin lakeshore the way people return to the geography of their childhood when they are trying to find the floor. Not looking for the past, just looking for ground. Scout was a 4-year-old black lab, glossy-coated and serious in the way that some labs are serious, the ones who seem to understand that the playfulness of the breed is a choice they are making rather than an instinct they can't suppress. James had raised him from 8 weeks, and the understanding between them was not the kind that requires reinforcement. Scout made his judgments quietly, and James had learned to trust them in the same way he had learned to trust the particular silence that precedes a decision worth making. The woman on the bench was named Ruth Erling. She was 82 years old. She had lived in Ashland for 59 years, had taught 4th grade at Vaughn Elementary for 31 of them, had been the kind of teacher that children remember by name 40 years later because she had seen them, not their grades. Them. Her husband Lester had died in November. She had been told it was his heart. She did not believe it was his heart. She had been inside the county building for an hour and 40 minutes before James found her on the bench. She had spoken to 2 people. The first had been a clerk who listened politely and suggested she direct her concerns in writing. The second had been a man named Dennis Farr, who was the director of the county's Adult Protective Services office, and who had listened to her for 11 minutes and then explained, in the careful tone of a man who had explained this before, that grief can reshape memory, that confusion following the loss of a long-term partner is medically documented, and that the county had no grounds to reopen a case that the medical examiner had already closed. He had used the phrase understandably disoriented twice. Ruth had counted. She was not disoriented. She knew what she had seen. James sat down beside her on the bench. Scout sat between them without being asked, which was a thing Scout occasionally did when he decided a situation required it. "They didn't believe me," she said. She said it to the folder in her arms, not to James. It was not a complaint. It was a statement of fact being placed somewhere outside herself so she could look at it. "What did you see?" James said. She looked at him for the first time. There was a particular way that people look at you when they have been told, recently and repeatedly, that their perception of reality is unreliable, a kind of guarded appraisal. The look of someone deciding whether this is another person who is about to do that. She studied him for a moment. Then she told him. Lester Erling had died on November 14th, a Thursday, at Ashland Memorial. He had been admitted 2 days prior with what the intake nurse noted as confusion and fatigue. He was 85 years old, and he had a caretaker, a man named Craig Doss, hired through a home care agency the previous spring, who had been present in the house every weekday afternoon since May. Ruth had been home every one of those afternoons, had watched Craig Doss work, had found him attentive and pleasant, had had no reason for alarm until August, when she noticed the medication. Lester took 3 prescriptions. Ruth had managed them for 20 years, with the precision of a woman who understood that the difference between the right dose and the wrong one was not abstract. In August, she noticed the pill organizer had been refilled differently, not wrong exactly, not in a way she could point to immediately, but different. She had mentioned it to Craig Doss. He had smiled and said he'd double-checked with the pharmacy. She had let it go. In September it happened again, and this time the difference was clear enough that she wrote it down. One of Lester's medications, a blood thinner he had been on for 7 years, had been reduced. Not eliminated, reduced. Not by the prescribing physician, whose office Ruth called on a Tuesday afternoon in October, and who confirmed that no dosage change had been authorized. She had called the agency. The agency had spoken to Craig Doss, who said there had been a miscommunication about refill instructions. The agency had noted the conversation in their file. In November, Lester was admitted to the hospital. He died of what the medical examiner recorded as cardiac arrest, consistent with his age and history. Ruth had sat with the death certificate in her kitchen on a Saturday morning and thought about the blood thinner and the pill organizer and the smile Craig Doss had offered her in August. And she had understood, with the clarity that comes to people who have spent their lives paying careful attention to things, that something had been done to her husband. She had the notes in the folder. She had the written record of the October phone call to the physician's office. She had Craig Doss's name and the name of the agency. What she did not have was anyone willing to look at what she had. Have you ever known someone like Ruth? Someone who saw something clearly, reported it carefully, was told they were mistaken, and who sat on a bench in the cold because they had nowhere else to take the truth. If that person is still in your life, sit with them. If they're not, tell me their name in the comments. They deserve to be remembered. James took the folder. He read through it there on the bench, in the February wind off the lake, while Scout sat pressed against Ruth's left side, with his chin lifted toward her hand in the patient offering of an animal who understands that sometimes the only thing required is to be present and warm. He read it twice. Then he said, "This is not nothing." Ruth looked at him the way she had looked at the man named Dennis Farr, with the appraising guard of someone who has been disappointed too recently to trust easily. The man inside said, "Grief reshapes memory." "He's wrong," James said. She held his gaze for 3 full seconds. Then she put her hand on Scout's head. Scout did not move. The next 4 days moved the way investigations move when the person conducting them has been trained to find the shape of things that other people have been trained to obscure. James had a contact in Milwaukee, a former JAG officer named Priya Okafor, who had left the military and joined a civil rights firm that handled, among other things, elder care cases. Priya pulled the agency's licensing records. Craig Doss had been employed by 3 agencies in the past 6 years. 2 of them had received complaints. Neither complaint had resulted in termination. One had been filed by a family in Iron County, whose father had died of causes described as consistent with his age. 14 months after Craig Doss began his care. The pattern was the pattern. James recognized it the way you recognize terrain you have crossed before from the air. Not the same ground, but the same shape. The urgency arrived on a Thursday evening in a phone call from Ruth's neighbor, a woman named Brenda Halloran, who had seen Craig Doss's car parked outside the Erling house. Doss had no reason to be there. Lester was dead. The contract with the agency had been terminated. Ruth had changed the locks. He had not gone to the door. He had sat in the car for 22 minutes and then driven away. Brenda had written down the time. Priya, when James called her, said the word intimidation in the flat tone of a lawyer who has seen this before and is choosing her words for a record. If the situation required a response, it required one before the week was out. Ruth was not afraid. This was the thing about her that James had understood from the bench. She was not asking for someone to stand between her and something frightening. She was asking for someone to stand beside her and confirm that what she had seen was real. Those are not the same request, and the distinction mattered. James drove to her house on Friday morning, Scout in the back seat, and he told her what Priya had found. And he watched her take it in with the stillness of a woman who has been waiting 11 weeks to be told that her own perception of reality was accurate. "I knew," she said. "I know you knew," James said. She looked at the window for a moment. The lake was visible from the kitchen, gray and wide, and carrying the last light of a February afternoon. "Lester would have wanted someone to say so," she said. He was that kind of man. He believed in saying so. James thought about his own father, about Gordon Aldrich, who had stayed in Park Falls when everyone else left, who had told James once that the thing about loyalty was that it cost you something, or it wasn't loyalty. He had said it about the town, but James had always understood it as a wider instruction, about people, about presence, about the specific choice to remain when remaining is harder than leaving. He thought about a corporal from his first tour named Ellis Webb, who had died in a vehicle outside Fallujah in 2005, and whose mother James had visited once in Louisville, and had not visited again because the grief in that house had been so total that he hadn't known how to hold it. He had driven home from Louisville on the interstate telling himself he would go back. And he had not gone back, and the weight of that had lived quietly in him ever since, like something unfinished. He thought about the things we owe to people who have been wronged in the dark, and what it costs when we look the other way, and he stayed for dinner. Craig Doss came to Ruth's house on Saturday morning. James had not expected it to be so direct, had expected another car idling at the curb, another act of ambient pressure. But Doss pulled into the driveway at 9:43, walked to the front door, and knocked with the confidence of a man who had calculated, in the privacy of his own reasoning, that the easiest move was to speak to Ruth directly before anything became official. He was 51 years old, well-groomed, and carried the surface plausibility of a person whose entire professional practice had required being trusted by people who were frightened and looking for someone calm. He knocked twice, and the door opened, and James was standing in it. Scout was already at James's heel, positioned forward, not beside, forward. And the sound that came out of him was the sound of a dog who has taken in the full information of a situation and made his conclusion known. It was low and without gap, a continuous register that was not alarm and not warning. It was decision. Craig Doss looked at Scout. Scout did not look away. When Doss shifted his weight to his left foot, Scout shifted his weight forward, closing the distance by 18 inches without being told. And the effect on Doss was immediate and physical. He stopped, recalculated, and looked past James into the room. Priya Okafor was at the kitchen table. Brenda Halloran was at the kitchen table. A Ashland County Sheriff's deputy named Marcus Trent, who had responded to the call Priya had placed the night before after reviewing the licensing records, stood near the counter with the quiet authority of a man whose presence alone constitutes a statement. And Ruth Erling stood in the center of her own kitchen in the house she had lived in for 59 years, holding nothing, needing nothing, standing the way a woman stands when she has been waiting for this specific moment and is fully prepared for it. Doss smiled. It was a reflex. "I just came to pay my respects," he said. "To Mrs. Erling. We worked together for months, and he moved my husband's medication," Ruth said. She did not say it loudly. It came out the way things come out of people when they have been carrying them in silence for too long, and the right room has finally appeared. Not a performance. Not prepared. Just the truth, stated in her own house, in front of witnesses. At the moment, the man who had done it believed he was still managing the situation. The room did not go loud. It went the opposite. Scout's growl did not change. He did not bark. He did not lunge. He stood in the position he had taken and did not leave it, his eyes on Craig Doss with an attention so complete it was almost courteous, the way a very serious and very certain dog looks at the thing he has decided about. James spoke. His voice had the quality it had in the field, the quality that had nothing to do with volume and everything to do with weight. The voice of a man who has made a decision that will not be revisited. He described the medication record. He described the October call to the physician. He described the Iron County case and the 2 prior complaints and the licensing records Priya had pulled. He described the car parked outside Ruth's house on Thursday evening for 22 minutes. He did not editorialize. He described. Priya confirmed, from the table, the documents she had in hand. Craig Doss looked at Deputy Trent. Deputy Trent looked at Craig Doss the way a man looks when he has been given all the information he needs. "I'd like to speak to an attorney," Doss said. "That's your right," James said. Doss left with the deputy. Scout watched him to the door. He tracked the movement of the vehicle through the window. When the sound of the engine faded entirely, he turned from the window, walked to where Ruth was standing, and sat down at her feet without being asked. Ruth put her hand on top of his head. She stood like that for a long moment, looking at nothing in particular, breathing. Then she said, "He believed me." She was not talking to anyone in the room. What happened in the weeks that followed moved through Ashland the way it moves through a small Wisconsin lakeshore city, through the diner on Main Street, and the coffee hour at St. Andrews, and the phone calls made between neighbors who had known each other for 40 years. Craig Doss was charged. The agency's licensing was suspended pending investigation. The Iron County case was reopened. Dennis Farr, the app's director who had used the phrase "understandably disoriented" twice in 11 minutes, submitted his resignation on a Friday, and it was accepted the same afternoon. Priya filed a civil action on Ruth's behalf. A local attorney named Gil Brandvik joined the case pro bono, the way certain people in certain small cities make themselves available when the situation is clear enough. The 4th grade teachers at Vaughn Elementary sent flowers. 31 of them. Past and present. Someone had organized it through the school's alumni group, and the arrangement arrived on a Tuesday with a card signed by so many names that Ruth sat with it for a long time at the kitchen table, reading each one. Before he left, Ruth made coffee the way she had made it every morning for 59 years. Strong, in the old percolator on the back burner, with 2 sugars in the cup she put in front of James without asking because she had been paying attention. Scout lay near the radiator with his chin on his paws, and through the kitchen window the lake was beginning to show the gray-green of early March. The ice pulling back from the shoreline in the slow concession of a Wisconsin winter, finally relenting. It looked, James thought, like the first morning of something. He went home to Park Falls in late March. He drove the road north with Scout asleep in the back seat and the lake somewhere to the right, behind the trees, carrying the last of the ice it would keep until April. He thought about what his father had said about loyalty costing you something. He thought about Ruth Erling standing in her kitchen holding nothing, needing nothing, saying the true thing in front of witnesses at last. He thought about Corporal Ellis Webb's mother in Louisville and about all the rooms he had not gone back to. And he thought that maybe the floor he had been looking for in the geography of his childhood was not a place, but a practice, not a return, but a choice, made again every time to cross the street. There are people in this world who do not ask to be rescued. They ask only that what they know be taken seriously, that someone be willing to stand beside them in the cold and say, "I believe you." That is not a small thing. It is, in many ways, the larger thing. James Aldrich had the same hours anyone else had that February. He was 20 minutes from leaving. Scout went still in the back seat. He got out of the truck. He crossed the street. He sat down. He listened. That was all. That was everything. This story is dedicated to everyone who has been told their grief was distorting them, their memory was unreliable, their certainty was confusion. You knew what you saw, and for anyone who has ever sat with a person in that position and simply said, "I believe you," that choice matters more than you know. Is there someone in your life like Ruth? Someone who saw something, reported it, and wasn't believed? Tell me about them in the comments. I read every one. Let's fill this section with the names of people who deserve to be heard. Every story on this channel is about choosing not to look away. If that means something to you, subscribe, so you're here for the next one. There are more stories to tell. Which moment in this story stayed with you? I'll see you in the comments.